That morning began like any other, except for the silence that felt heavier than air. I stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of my charcoal blazer, and realized I had been staring at myself for too long. It was our 9th anniversary. Though the date felt more like a statistic than a celebration, the Boston skyline glowed faintly behind the glass. I arrived at Trevor's glass-walled office in Beacon Hill, carrying a small, symbolic gift of the first project we ever built together. I expected nostalgia. I found reality. Through the cracked door, I overheard him telling his mistress, Shelby, that I was rigid, a money-making machine without a soul. He called her his true love, the freedom he had always searched for. I didn't shatter. I didn't drop the gift. I simply turned away, tossed the model into a trash can on Charles Street, and locked the door to my heart forever. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? The person everyone relies on, but no one actually sees? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The leather of the driver's seat felt like ice against my legs as I sat in my car, parked just a few blocks away from the office, where Trevor was still busy declaring his freedom. I didn't reach for a tissue, and I didn't even reach for the mirror to see if my eyes were red. My face was a mask of cold, hard concrete. I picked up my phone and dialed Destiny. She answered on the second ring, her voice already prepared for the checklist of my life. Destiny, I said, my voice sounding like a gavel hitting a block. I need you to listen carefully. This is no longer a personal matter, it's a recovery operation. I instructed her to remove Trevor as an authorized signer on the primary accounts and to cancel the secondary cards immediately. Since the capital was legally mine, filed under my social security number, I wanted his access severed before he could drain another cent. I told her to revoke Trevor's secondary access to the corporate high-limit cards and to flag every transaction he had made in the last 90 days. I wanted an internal audit of the agency's creative fund started by the end of the hour. Natalie? She hesitated. Is everything all right? Everything is finally clear, I replied. Trevor told his little friend that he found freedom. I'm just making sure he doesn't have to carry the heavy weight of my capital while he enjoys it. I hung up and watched a couple walking through the park. They looked happy. I wondered if the woman knew she was likely the one paying for the dog's premium food and the man's designer shoes. For 9 years, I had been the silent investor in Trevor's version of success. I had provided the safety net, the health insurance, the legal protection, and the liquid capital. I was the load-bearing wall he never bothered to look at because he was too busy admiring the aesthetic of the room I had built for him. He called me a money-making machine. He called me rigid. It's a common tactic for people who live in houses they didn't build. They complain about the rigidity of the beams, while those same beams are the only thing keeping the roof from crushing them. He wanted a muse. He wanted Shelby's pure love that supposedly didn't care about money. Well, pure love shouldn't require a $10,000 monthly allowance for his mother or a company-leased luxury SUV. I pulled out of the parking space, my hands steady on the steering wheel. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an audit. Every month of the last decade flashed through my mind like a balance sheet that refused to reconcile. I had treated our marriage like a partnership, a shared venture where I bore the risk so he could create. But Trevor didn't want a partner. He wanted infrastructure that processed his failures and stayed invisible when it worked. As I drove through Back Bay, the city lights began to flicker on. I realized that betrayal doesn't always sound like a shout. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet clicking of a lock being changed. I wasn't angry. Anger is a luxury for those who still think there is something left to negotiate. I was clinical, I was precise, I was moving his entire existence back to the zero balance starting line. He wanted to see what freedom felt like. I was about to show him that freedom is very cold when you've spent 9 years living in someone else's warmth. I sat in my study that evening, and the only sound was the soft hum of my laptop and the rhythm of my own breathing. I opened the file labeled Home Accounts. For 9 years, I had treated this folder like a sacred vow. Now, I saw it for what it truly was, a ledger of my own exploitation. I scrolled back, my eyes tracing the lines of a story I had refused to read for far too long. There it was, the first tuition renewal for Trevor's graduate school. I had paid it with my entire bonus check, whispering that partnership meant a shared burden. I remembered the pride I felt signing for the $500,000 loan to expand his agency. I was the sole guarantor. I had placed my name, my reputation, and my future on the line so he could have the luxury of creating without the fear of failing. And then there were the monthly transfers. $10,000 every 30 days, coded in the books as family consulting fees to keep the IRS happy, sent like clockwork to his mother, Teresa. It was a gift, I told myself, a way to ensure the family stayed whole. I had been the silent investor in their version of status. I had provided the scaffolding for a house that was never designed to hold me. I leaned back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. People might look at these numbers and ask why I stayed. They might call it weakness, but they don't understand the invisible chain of a survivor. For 9 years, I wasn't being weak. I was being a builder. I lived in a prison without bars, one I had constructed out of my own loyalty and the belief that if I carried enough weight, the balance would eventually return. My endurance was my pride. I thought my silence was strength, but it was actually the insulation that kept Trevor and his family warm while I stayed out in the cold. He called me rigid because I insisted on structure, yet he never realized that structure was the only thing keeping him from total collapse. I realized then that Trevor didn't want a wife. He wanted infrastructure. He wanted a system that absorbed pressure, processed his failures, and stayed invisible when it worked. He called me rigid because I insisted on structure, yet he never realized that structure was the only thing keeping him from total collapse. I had been the load-bearing wall of his entire existence. I had processed every deadline, every crisis, and every overdue bill, so he could play the role of the free spirit. I looked at the latest entries. Small withdrawals, restaurant charges, rental payments to a luxury unit in the Seaport district, just blocks from where Shelby lived. He wasn't just unfaithful. He was financing his true love with the joint accounts I managed. He was using my labor to pay for his replacement. The irony was as sharp as a razor. He praised Shelby for not caring about money while he used my money to buy the air she breathed. My hands didn't shake as I printed the statements. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. It was a balance sheet that finally had to be reconciled. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the auditor, and the audit was complete. Trevor had mistaken my competence for a permanent subsidy. He was about to learn that when the load-bearing wall walks away, the rest of the house doesn't just sag. It implodes. I didn't have to wait long for the first aftershock. The glass doors of my Back Bay agency didn't just open. They were practically shoved aside. Teresa and Kelsey marched toward my desk. their faces a frantic mix of panic and high society outrage. They looked like they'd just escaped a disaster, but I knew better. They'd just escaped a luxury spa where the transaction had failed. "Natalie, what on earth is going on?" Teresa demanded, slamming her designer bag onto my mahogany desk. I was in the middle of a treatment when the receptionist told me in front of everyone that my card was declined. Kelsey stood behind her, arms crossed, nodding like a rhythmic parasite. Mine too. "It was humiliating, Natalie. Do you have any idea how that looks?" I looked at them the way one looks at a spreadsheet that refuses to balance. For years, I'd been the silent guarantor of their dignity. I had paid the $10,000 monthly allowance to Teresa and covered Kelsey's cell phone bundle and medical plan without a word. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years. Watching them, I realized they were suffering from the power illusion of an empty wallet. They truly believed their social standing was inherent, a birthright they carried in their blood. They didn't understand that their status was just a rented coat, and I was the one paying the lease. When I stopped the funding, their authority didn't just crumble, it vanished, because it had no internal structure. "It was an administrative update, Teresa," I said, my voice steady as concrete. "The accounts are being audited." Teresa's mouth tightened into a thin line of practiced moral superiority. "Don't be petty, Natalie. We know about Trevor. Men are weak. They have moments where they lose their way. A smart wife handles that quietly within the family." Kelsey chimed in, her voice dripping with that familiar entitlement. "You're being cold. Money isn't everything, you know. You can't just destroy a family over a mistake." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It's funny how money is only not everything when it's someone else's money you're spending. You've been living on my paychecks for 5 years, yet you still think silence is a virtue I owe you. "Natalie!" Teresa gasped, as if the truth were an insult she couldn't process. "I'm not destroying a family," I said, standing up and smoothing my blazer. "I'm ending a transaction. You mistook dependency for belonging, and I mistook enabling for love." I gestured toward the door. "Destiny will validate your parking on the way out. But from this moment forward, the Bank of Natalie is closed permanently." I arrived at the office the next day long before the first delivery trucks started their rattle through the streets of Boston. The city was still half asleep, shrouded in a grey mist that felt as sterile as my own thoughts. I sat at my computer and opened the spreadsheet that had quietly carried our entire marriage. Every number on that screen was a thread, and I began to pull them one by one. When people talk about revenge, they often imagine shouting matches and thrown plates. Mine was purely administrative. By 8 o'clock, Destiny was in my office. Her tablet open, her expression as neutral as mine. "Let's start with the consulting contract," I said, my voice steady as concrete. I handed her the final authorization for Trevor's termination. "Cite a breach of ethical standards, no embellishment, no adjectives, just the facts." Destiny looked at the document. "Should we notify him first?" I didn't look up from my screen. "No. Silence will deliver the message." She hesitated. "Natalie, this might burn some bridges." I looked at her then, my eyes clear. Bridges built on deceit deserve fire. We moved through the list with clinical precision. I revoked Trevor's secondary access to every high-tier corporate account and flagged his creative spending for a full historical audit. I removed his name and the names of his family members from the company's premium health insurance and the concierge medical plans I had been subsidizing for years. I even disabled the company-paid cell phone bundle Kelsey had used to gossip about my rigidity. Every instruction I gave was framed as a simple procedural update. I wasn't acting out of rage, I was correcting an imbalance. I had spent 9 years being the infrastructure that processed Trevor's failures and stayed invisible when things worked. I was done being the scaffolding for his illusions. By noon, I had contacted the university's urban design board. I withdrew our agency's sponsorship for the research grant Trevor had been using as a personal playground. I cited the discovery of financial irregularities in his department, which gave me the legal standing to trigger an immediate audit and suspension of funds. "It is done," Destiny said, returning to my office with a folder of confirmations. "Thank you," I replied. "Take the rest of the day off, Destiny. You've worked hard." When she reached the door, she turned back. A flicker of something, maybe pity, in her eyes. I cut it off before it could land. "Don't feel sorry for them, Destiny. They've been living on overdraft empathy for years. I am just returning their life to its actual room temperature." The office was silent after she left. I didn't feel triumph, I felt completion. I had spent a decade building a world for people who didn't value the labor it took to keep it standing. Now, I was simply letting gravity take over. By late afternoon, the sun was casting long, needle-like shadows across my office floor, piercing the quiet of the agency. I had spent hours in a state of hyper-focused stillness, but the air shifted the moment Destiny walked back in. Her usual professional mask was gone, replaced by a stunned, pallid stillness. She didn't speak immediately. She simply set a thick manila folder on my desk and stepped back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I found the discrepancy in the $500,000 expansion loan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't a bookkeeping error or a series of unfortunate creative expenses." I opened the folder and felt the cold precision of the truth land. Trevor hadn't used that capital to hire new production leads or to secure the high-end warehouse space we had discussed. Instead, he had diverted $50,000 of the agency's money to lease a private penthouse for Shelby. He hadn't just moved on. He had built a monument to his freedom using the bricks I had paid for. I turned the page and saw the document that would end everything. It was a cancelled check for $40,000 made out to an upscale art gallery. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like mine, the same fluid loops, the same precise slant, but I hadn't signed it. Trevor had forged my name to fund Shelby's private exhibition. He had reached into my personal identity and stolen it to validate his muse. In that moment, I didn't feel the familiar ache of a wife being betrayed. I felt the clinical satisfaction of an architect finding the fatal flaw in a rival's blueprint. This wasn't a breakdown. This was accounting. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silent room. "Destiny, pull up the shareholder agreement from 2 years ago," I said, my voice sounding like a knife edge. I remembered the day he signed it. He had wanted my personal guarantee on that $500,000 loan, and in exchange, I had demanded an updated shareholder contract. He had called me controlling and distrustful as he scribbled his name, never bothering to read the fine print I had drafted with our legal counsel. I flipped the pages until I reached section 12, the moral breach clause. It was a lethally specific provision. It stated that any partner who engaged in criminal activity or a material breach of fiduciary duty, specifically embezzlement or forgery, would automatically forfeit their entire equity stake back to the company. No compensation, no buyout. Just clean subtraction. Trevor had spent 9 years thinking I was the scaffolding for his life, but he never realized I was also the one holding the demolition permits. By forging my name and embezzling those funds, he hadn't just broken a heart, he had triggered a legal suicide switch. He was no longer a shareholder. He was a trespasser in his own career. Draft the formal notice of forfeiture, I told Destiny. Attach the evidence of the $50,000 diversion and the $40,000 forged check. This is a material breach of fiduciary duty. We aren't just firing him, we are triggering the bad actor provision to erase his ownership entirely. This isn't a negotiation. It's a foreclosure on a life he never truly earned. The rain was a thin, persistent drizzle against the windows of my Beacon Hill home when the buzzer finally rang. I didn't have to look at the security feed to know who was standing there. The silence in the house was a stark contrast to the storm Trevor was about to bring inside. I opened the door, but I didn't step back to let him in. Trevor stood on the threshold, looking like a rough draft of the man I had married. His designer coat was soaked, his hair was a mess, and the easy confidence that usually defined his face had been replaced by a raw, desperate hollow. "Natalie," he rasped, his voice cracking on my name. "Nat, please. We need to talk. This has gone too far." "I told you at the studio, Trevor," I said, my voice steady as a heartbeat. "We already talked. You just didn't like the ending. The locks were changed." "My cards are dead. I can't even get into the penthouse," he stammered, stepping closer. "Shelby, she's gone. Nat. She said if I couldn't even pay the association fees, there was no point in exploring our freedom anymore. She left me in an empty hallway." I almost laughed. "Freedom is expensive, Trevor. It turns out your muse only inspired you as long as the inspiration came with a gold-plated credit limit." "You're being cruel," he shouted, his eyes red and brimming with a mix of fury and self-pity. 9 years, Natalie. I gave you 9 years. And you're treating me like a criminal. You're destroying everything we built." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single thin folder. I didn't hand it to him, I held it up like a mirror. "I'm not destroying anything, Trevor. I'm just letting the structures you built on lies meet their actual weight-bearing capacity. Inside this folder is the evidence of the $40,000 check you forged with my signature and the $50,000 you embezzled from the expansion loan." He went silent, the color draining from his face until he looked as grey as the Boston sky. "You signed the moral breach clause 2 years ago," I reminded him, my tone clinical. "By your own hand, you forfeited your shares the moment you picked up that pen to forge my name. This isn't revenge, this is accounting. And regarding the $500,000 loan, I've already filed a formal fraud report with the authorities and the bank's legal department. They have preliminarily flagged the debt as fraudulent and are moving to transfer the full liability to you personally. You wanted the freedom of an entrepreneur, Trevor. Now you have the debt to match. Natalie, please, I'm your husband." "No," I corrected him, moving to close the door. "You were a transaction I finally decided to close. I'm not cruel, Trevor. I'm just returning your life to its actual room temperature, the cold, quiet place where you belonged before I decided to keep you warm." I clicked the lock shut, and for the first time in 9 years, I didn't hear the sound of his needs. I only heard the rain. 6 months have passed since the rain washed the last traces of Trevor's entitlement off my doorstep, and time no longer feels like a heavy weight I'm forced to carry. My life has settled into a precision I haven't felt in years, an efficiency that replaced the constant, frantic urgency of managing someone else's chaos. My agency is flourishing, not out of pity for my situation, but because the lifeblood of the company is finally being reinvested into its own growth instead of siphoning off to fund a muse who disappeared the moment the money did, the consequences for Trevor and his family were as inevitable as gravity. I heard recently that Trevor is working a basic sales job downtown. His name was removed from every prestigious university listing, and his professional reputation now comes with a permanent footnote of financial irregularity. Teresa and Kelsey were forced to sell the mansion to pay back the debts that had piled up beneath their feet, moving into a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. The mansion, which I later discovered was heavily leveraged with multiple mortgages, was finally seized after the bank realized the consulting fees paying the interest had vanished. Teresa and Kelsey were forced out, moving into a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city with nothing but their pride. They finally had to learn the true cost of independence when there was no one left to overdraft empathy from. I've come to realize that letting go of those toxic ties wasn't an act of cruelty, it was a necessary revolution. I had to learn that family is not a license for exploitation, and love shouldn't demand your total disappearance. For 9 years, I lived in a house I built with my own hands, never realizing I had been treated as a function rather than a person. By choosing to walk away, I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was reclaiming my own worth from people who only valued me for what I could provide. To anyone listening who feels like they are the only thing keeping their world from collapsing, remember that you are not a load-bearing wall for people who refuse to build their own foundation. You don't owe your life to those who only remember to ask you for money or maintenance. Peace doesn't arrive as a reward for your endurance. It arrives in the absence of the noise that others bring into your life. If you find yourself in a similar situation, know that it is okay to return to room temperature. Forgiveness isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it is the quiet act of closing a door and never looking back. If you're still holding up a world that doesn't hold you back, your clarity starts tonight. Share this story if you've ever had to choose yourself instead of a parasite. And let me know in the comments, what is your peace costing you right now?